Welcome to the Mental Wellbeing Show, where we take a deep dive into the wonderful worlds of psychology and mental wellbeing. This episode of the Mental Wellbeing Show is with Dr. Simon Goldberg. Simon is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin Madison, who has researched on mindfulness for decades and published scores of papers on the subject. We discuss the science of mindfulness, the different practices of mindfulness, including sitting meditation, how to develop mindfulness in everyday life, as well as strategies to make mindfulness meditation a daily practice. I heard Dr. John Kabat-Zinn the other day, a highly influential figure of the Western mindfulness movement and science, say that mindfulness is not sitting under a lotus tree cross-legged like a Buddha, but rather it's a way of life and being throughout each and every day. So are you able to elaborate on that and kind of give us a bit of an overview as to what mindfulness is?
Yeah, well, I would trust anything John Kabat-Zinn says before me. But I think, right, we have this image of the Buddha sitting under, the Bodhi tree or under a blooming lotus or something like this. But even if we look at the historic Buddha, the Buddha didn't stay sitting under the Bodhi tree, and in fact was deeply engaged in the world and had a whole entourage of monks and nuns and lay people, and was very involved in life after his awakening. So I think even, in the classical Buddhist world, we see that the Buddha was very involved. And I think, of course, mindfulness practice is intended to help us show up in our lives in a deeper and kinder way, hopefully. So I like John's definition of mindfulness as a way of paying attention that's on purpose in the present moment and without judgment. And some of the mindfulness teaching I get to do at the University of Wisconsin, I love to come up with synonyms for that term non-judgment. And a few that I really love and I think students have resonated with are words like kindness or curiosity. I really love curiosity as a word to describe that way of orienting, acceptance, openness, that kind of quality. And that really, to me, it's the paying attention, but it's also that quality, or John will sometimes use the word love even to describe mindfulness. And I think that you get some flavor of that too.
So with this kind of non-judgmental and acceptance of and paying attention to each moment, why do you feel like it is so important to accept each part of our experience, particularly kind of the uglier parts of the experience? Because I find it a lot easier to not accept, perhaps when I'm feeling sad or angry, and just to try and repress those. So what is kind of the beauty and value of paying attention to those moments?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, in many ways, I think our Western culture is built on avoiding and suppressing and distracting painful things. I'm sure that humans have done that all over the world, but I think of, our sort of Western consumerism and the news media and so forth. I mean, for me, looking at my own mind, if you're not willing to see what's happening, you're really at a disadvantage to have it go differently, right? So,
right.
In my own practice, I've been doing more kind of Vipassana style practice in recent years and doing a lot of noting practice, actually. And it's really been extremely helpful to have a better sense of what's happening in my mind. And as much as I'm able and willing in a particular moment to name it as greed or delusion or restlessness or wanting or compassion or kind of whatever is happening, and really taking a sober look at internal experience has been really helpful, even just to understand how the mind is working and what leads to what at a basic kind of fundamental way.
So is that, when you say noting, is this kind of notion of name it to tame it?
I've been coming at it more from kind of the Mahasi style, or my understanding of the kind of classic Vipassana Mahasi style instruction. I suppose it could maybe not necessarily even with the intention of taming it, but name it to know it, maybe, just as a way of sort of turning on the lights to our experience and being able to see what's actually happening moment to moment and what our minds are up to, which isn't always good news. I think there's the joke that self-knowledge is never good news. It's or something like that. But in the long term, I think it's really helpful and really our best shot at cultivating kind of healthy habits of mind that we all want to cultivate.
Can you perhaps give us an example of what that looks like in your life, and because I'm trying to think of an example of how it does in mine, and I think certainly having a mindfulness-based practice has helped me to kind of just pause in between reactions to stimuli in my environment. Like when I'm driving, for example, I find I'm less reactive when I've been
Yeah.
consistent for a period of months with a mindfulness, daily mindfulness practice. But what does it look like in your life?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the ways, so on retreat, one of the things I've noticed, just to maybe this is not as sciencey as maybe you wanted, Indy, but just sharing from my experience. I mean, one of the habits that I've noticed in my mind is a thread of competitiveness and comparison, and sort of judging my practice in a way, which I know is a common experience for lots of us. So just noticing that habit in the context of retreat, which in many ways is this sort of like pristine environment with relatively few things for the mind to get worked up on or by, as versus daily life. So seeing it come up in that context is really, I feel like, been telling that this is a deep habit, and really kind of seeing the process, how it unfolds and all the pain associated with it. And then coming back to the world. So I'm a professor, and academia is very competitive and has plenty of opportunities for those same sorts of habits of mind to come up. So being able to recognize it in retreat, and then when it's happening outside of retreat, just to notice that that's what the mind's doing, that it's comparing, or that it's judging, or that it's jealous, or that it's wanting. And not even necessarily that something needs to be done about that in a particular moment, beyond just seeing that that's what's happening, and really being with that experience, being with the unpleasantness of that experience, if that's what's happening, and as much as possible, not letting the experience be reified as this is me or this is mine, has been really helpful to let that pass through, knowing that it will change, knowing that it's a habit of mind, that it doesn't belong to me in a sense, has been really helpful for living in an environment which I think not always the most wholesome effects on my mind stream. So that's one example. Does that clarify a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. And I think as well, it's good to hear about how it's perhaps benefited you in everyday life. But I know as well that you've done a lot of research, Simon, looking at kind of mindfulness-based interventions or MBIs and how they can be useful in a more clinical
Yeah.
setting for mental illnesses and psychopathology. So I was reading a 2018, I think, meta-analysis by yourself and colleagues, and I'm wondering if you're able to tell us a little bit about these MBIs and the effectiveness of them compared to other evidence-based therapies for mental illnesses.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so a couple things. I mean, that study's a few years old. There have been even more trials since then, and there actually was another meta-analysis that came out just this month or last month that compared mindfulness-based interventions. I think it was mindfulness-based cognitive therapy to cognitive behavioral therapy. And what they essentially found in that study, which is the same thing that we found in our meta-analysis, is that when these two, what we describe in the psychotherapy world as bona fide interventions that are intended to be therapeutic, that have real therapeutic ingredients and cogent rationales for how they work, that these two families of therapy perform almost indistinguishably, and they're almost identical when compared head to head. And that's actually something that we saw looking at the whole MBI literature, when a wide variety of MBIs, not just mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, but the variety of MBIs that are being tested out there, when they're compared head to head with other evidence-based treatments like CBT or antidepressants for that matter, that they perform almost identically well. And actually, that's a finding that we see in the psychotherapy literature in general, that when any two bona fide psychotherapies, whether it's psychodynamic treatments, cognitive behavioral therapy, emotion focused therapy, when they're put side by side in a trial, they tend to perform about equally well. And that's something that's been shown across large parts of the literature, actually.
Is this the dodo bird effect,
Exactly.
as it's
Yeah,
referred to?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, then, do you think there's a certain type of person or a certain, kind of personality profile, or what kind of conditions would MBIs be more kind of useful for in clinical treatment compared to, say, CBT or other bona fide treatments, keeping in mind that, they are fairly, equal in their in their efficacy in these trials?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question. And quite frankly, I don't know that we know the answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
As versus meta-analysis, which you can fairly reasonably combine across studies to get estimates of effect sizes of one treatment versus another, when your question is a question of moderation, where it's, does the effect of the treatment depend on some baseline characteristic? And people will test that in this study and in that study, but it's not consistent, the variables that are being tested, and it's really not straightforward to combine them in a way to get these kind of literature-wide estimates. Mm-hmm. So one of the ways that people are getting around that is doing these individual patient data meta-analyses, where you're combining across individual data sets from these different trials. So there's some work going in that direction, but at this point, Indy, I don't think we really have a clear answer. I mean, I've been involved in studies where, for example, we showed that people who were higher in rumination at baseline responded best to a mindfulness-based or a meditation-based app, for example. And other studies have looked at baseline rumination. There's been some work in the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy that looked at early adversity as a predictor of treatment. I mean, for me as a clinician, I think if somebody's interested, then they should try it.
Right. Okay.
And that if somebody's more in, like, if one treatment sounds more interesting, they're just kind of drawn to it more. They hear a little bit about cognitive behavioral therapy or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy or whatever your treatment is, and they're interested in it. That's a really great place and a very reasonable place to start from a data standpoint.
So, just thinking then in regards to kind of this dodo bird effect and the fact that, all these bona fide therapies, show largely similar treatment outcomes, are there specific mechanisms of these mindfulness-based interventions which make it particularly potent? Like, for example, I think I was looking across some of the research, values clarification, emotion regulation.
Yeah.
Are these some of the mechanisms that underlie these MBIs, and also do you feel like they're unique to MBIs as opposed to other treatments?
Yeah, at this point, I don't think that we have particularly clear data on mechanism, actually. And there are other people who study mechanism a lot more than I do and a lot more rigorously and using more sophisticated methods. But for example, there haven't been recent meta-analyses, at least, demonstrating the effects of mediation, which is one of the ways that we test mechanism, where we look to see whether a treatment predicts change in a mediator and whether change in that mediator is associated with outcomes. So some of the classic things that we think about in the mindfulness-based space, attention, emotion regulation, different measures of trait mindfulness, the data is not entirely convincing for any of these individual mediators. And there are some reasons, like I was saying for moderation before, that it's hard to combine across studies and people have to be, testing them and reporting them in similar ways. But one of the things I've been thinking about a lot, and I think you're alluding to this a little bit, is the possibility that there are what we might think of as non-specific or common factors that are mediators across a wide variety of treatments. So one of the classic ones from the psychotherapy literature is this notion of therapeutic alliance, which is this connection between a therapist and a client and agreement on the tasks and the goals of therapy. And there's some evidence suggesting that therapeutic alliance is present in mindfulness interventions and predicts outcomes. And that's really something that we've seen across literally hundreds of studies in the psychotherapy literature. But even that association is largely a correlational one, where people aren't typically manipulating therapeutic alliance. So even this is this replicated finding, it really seems to make a difference how aligned you feel with your therapist or with the therapy. But even that one, we haven't always experimentally manipulated. So it's hard to kind of say definitively.
It's fascinating, that whole the common factors, and seeing that you have such similar treatment outcomes for all these different therapeutic modalities. I wanted to change tack a little bit with you, Simon, and talk a little bit about the utility of mindfulness, perhaps in the moment when we're feeling heightened and distressed, and when our sympathetic nervous system is particularly online. And I've been thinking of a few examples when my heart rate's pumping and sweating palms. And is there utility for mindfulness in that very specific
moment to help us step back from and out of that particular kind of physical state. I referred earlier to the driving example, and that's something that has
Yeah.
helped me. But yeah, are there particular strategies that people can actually use in the moment, or is it more of a building the mindfulness in the background consistently for months on end, and then that will kind of play out when you have these moments of heightenedness?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And my guess is that that's one that varies across people and varies within people across time, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know in my own experience, mindfulness can be really helpful to notice what's happening, or notice, that I'm driving and I'm getting grumpy with my fellow drivers. I know in my own experience, mindfulness can be a great way to be aware of and be accepting as much as one's able of what's happening. But there's lots of different mental strategies that people can use. I mean, there can be skillful times to engage in distraction. For example, I know I asked Sharon Salzberg at one point about recommendations for public speaking, for feeling less anxious when public speaking, and she said that something that had been really helpful for her was doing loving kindness practice, and
Right.
intentionally cultivating feelings of warmth and kindness towards oneself and other, and that can transform that sort of evaluative stress of public speaking, and probably road rage for that matter, where we
Mm.
are feeling not loving kindness towards our fellow passengers. I think a lot of the stuff, I mean, the amazing thing at this particular historical moment is there are beautiful, deep contemplative traditions that are in, deep dialogue with the West. And there's a lot of different strategies that people have access to now. And I think it's really exciting. And it's really, I think, an invitation to do some exploring in our own experience. And one thing from my life, I do a lot of bike commuting. And when I remember, I try to send a little loving kindness as I'm riding my bike. And that can undo some of the aggressive feelings or the just sort of distracted mind wandering that happens for most of us most of the time.
Mm.
To use that as a chance to cultivate something, maybe a little healthier.
And in terms of, the different mindfulness strategies that are available to us these days, what about things like mindful eating, mindful exercising? Do these have, the same benefits, or do they play out as having benefits in the literature compared to more, you know, notable or established practices like meditation? Or has this been kind of just diluted by the self-help kind of literature, and you don't really see much evidence for these kind of practices?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And really, we don't have, as far as I know, a lot of data. I mean, one example from our work, we have a meditation app called the Healthy Minds Program, and it has in it sitting practices that are intended to be done as the primary thing, sitting in a chair, sitting on a cushion. But then there are also active practices that are designed to be done in the context of daily life when you're commuting or folding laundry or cleaning the house. And we haven't done a head-to-head comparison to see if one is better than the other. And I think it's really an open question. And there might be some people, I mean, I've talked to plenty of students and friends and colleagues who really find sitting meditation very unpleasant. And it's
Mm.
not helpful for calming their mind. It's not helpful for connecting with their experience as far as they can tell. But moving practice, yoga practices or mindful exercise, like you were saying, can really be the doorway in for some people. So I think my guess is that there's a lot of these sort of individual differences that get masked when we run the trials. And a lot of these questions, we haven't even run trials comparing sitting or active practices. So there's a lot
Mm.
more to be learned. And just one thing to tag on to that, I think that's one of the reasons I'm really intrigued in about technology, because I think that's a way that we can personalize these practices and have them kind of more integrated into daily life in ways that we really haven't had a chance, and humans haven't had a chance at this point because of the advances in technology.
Can we dive into that a little deeper? So what would that look like in terms of technology and mindfulness practices?
I mean, one of the examples I think of in my own life, I mean, I've seen, the sort of like doom scrolling. We all have our version of this, maybe,
Mm.
where you're a little distracted, maybe you're a little stressed, and you kind of engage in unhealthy habits, whether it's news or social media or some other form of distraction. And I think it would be really cool and not really outside of the question that in the next 10 years, we could have tools coming online that know our habits and kind of nudge us in healthier directions and nudge our mind in healthier directions based on our behavior.
Perfect. That makes sense, and I think it's certainly a lot of scope for that, right? With the advances in technology we're seeing these days, just so rapid. Do you think that technology has a place in terms of helping us establish a more consistent mindfulness practice, and what would that look like, perhaps as well, in more detail, if you can?
Yeah, I think it definitely could. I mean, I think one of the things, especially when people are getting started, it can be hard to not have guidance. And, most of us are carrying these smartphones around that can have meditation apps on them, that can have really sophisticated guidance, and even eventually guidance that's more tailored to our own habits of mind or how we're reacting to different practices. So I think that's one way, just having kind of a teacher in our pocket. I also think that kind of integration of active practices in the context of daily life is really exciting and can be a way to kind of lower the bar. And then even at a maybe lighter weight level, the idea of informal practice interventions where people are just getting small nudges, right? So my phone detects that I'm riding my bike. It knows somehow that that's a time that I like to practice loving kindness. Is there a way that it can remind me to just kind of nudge the mind in that direction? And I think that's the sort of thing that is entirely possible. I mean, one example from another group here at the University of Wisconsin, they are studying alcohol use disorder, and they have an app that they've developed that alerts someone if they're going near to a location where they've previously used alcohol, if they're trying to not use alcohol. And that kind of location specific reminder at the right time for a target behavior that's really important to this individual can be a really powerful way to change some of our habits. So that's just an example. And I really think, in the next 10 years, this is the sort of thing. It's probably a little hard for us to imagine how it could evolve, but I'm confident that we'll be seeing things in this direction.
Well, as a mindfulness researcher and expert in the field, do you have advice as to how individuals can establish and maintain a consistent mindfulness practice? So I know there's been, certainly advice you've given already, but even for someone like myself, I've struggled over the years to really establish a consistent practice.
Yeah.
So, and it's something that I see talking to a lot of friends, and is, the struggle the understanding of the benefits, but the struggle to kind of to implement that consistency with mindfulness. So how did you go about doing it, and what advice could you share for people who are looking to do the same?
No, I love that question, Indy. And I'm super fascinated by that, because I think there are lots of health behaviors. I mean, we could think of exercise or healthy diet that we know, things that we know are good for us, but we don't always do. And I just think that's such a fascinating part of human behavior. I mean, a couple thoughts. One, advice that I've heard Richie Davidson, the director of the Center for Healthy Minds, where I work, talk about mindfulness as mental hygiene. And that, some hundreds of years ago, nobody was brushing their teeth. And now most people brush their teeth, often twice a day, and are spending a couple minutes because we've learned as a culture that that's something that's worth doing for our health. And really, I hear that as making the case for even just small amounts of practice, right? You brush your teeth maybe for 2 minutes in the morning, 2 minutes in the evening. Could we spend a minute, being with the body, being with the breath, doing some loving kindness, doing something to sort of encourage some mental hygiene? So I think that can be a way that we don't have to think, oh, I have to sit 45 minutes a day in the morning and 45 in the evening to really be developing a meditation practice. I mean, in my own experience, from literally the very first time I tried meditation, I found it really helpful and really compelling. And not that it wasn't easy, not that it wasn't hard. It actually was really challenging to be with my internal experience. And when I started practicing, I was having a lot of painful internal experiences. So it wasn't easy, but I could tell even from the first few times practicing that it was helping me work with that experience. And it was in a way kind of taking the edge off some of the unpleasantness of those experiences. So I think for me, there's this kind of negative reinforcement where something unpleasant is stopping during the practice or as a result of the practice. And I think that's been I've been really grateful actually for that as something that's helped me stay engaged with practice. So I would say if people are starting, I mean, hopefully there's some sense either of something unpleasant that maybe softens a little bit or loosens a little bit, and also exploring if there's some part of the experience that is pleasant, that there is some relaxing or easeful or quiet or peaceful quality that, again, our culture doesn't encourage us to look for that or to value that. But those experiences can be really beautiful. And we have that capacity as human beings. I mean, we have a mind that can experience deep, profound states of calm and quiet and stillness and joy with nothing from the outside. I mean, that's what's so amazing about the human mind. Not that it doesn't take a lot of work and that it's kind of immediately accessible to all of us, but maybe some faith in a way that capacity is part of our birthright as human beings. And I think to varying degrees, that's true.
Oh, brilliant, Simon. Yeah, it's very, very thoughtful, and I think a lot there, certainly for me to stew on and think about how that does relate to my own mindfulness practice. Just finally, is there any piece of advice that you want to share with people listening, on the mindfulness-based literature, practices, or other?
Yeah, I think just one thing, in some of the data that we've been studying, actually persistence of practice for people who are exposed to meditation. And one of the factors that really seems to be a strong predictor is the perception of there being social norms where the people in one's network are supportive of one engaging in practice. There's a Buddhist corollary to that too, where the Buddha in some of the early writings talks about good friends as being a really important part of the path. So just the encouragement, I mean, if there are kind of people in one's network, or maybe you're the person in someone else's network, to do some practice together, to connect with a teacher or connect with a group, can really make a big difference in supporting each other and encouraging confidence that practice can be helpful. So that's one piece. And then maybe the caveat to that is to acknowledge that meditation is not for everybody, and that there are really, I think, probably an infinite number of ways that as human beings we can train our minds and train our hearts, and meditation is one of many of them. So not to think that it's the only way to feel any better in one's life, or the only way to feel some happiness, that there's a lot of different ways, but is a way that, there's a fair amount of data suggesting that on average it is helpful for a lot of people.
Lovely, Simon. Thank you very much. I think there's a lot of really good practical carrots, but also a lot of deep insights there for us to reflect on. So yeah, thank you very much for that.
Thanks for having me.